Almost 4 billion people rely on agri-food systems for their livelihoods.
Half of them are women prevented from realizing their potential,
Held back by inequality and discrimination,
marginalized,
and denied agency.
working in poorer conditions with lower wages, carrying a greater burden of care and unpaid work.
Women have always worked hard for agri-food systems.
It's time to make agri-food systems work better for women.
Greater equality means
Greater resilience, greater social, economic,
and environmental sustainability
empowering women and achieving gender equality,
could bring huge gains
better agricultural production,
and child nutrition,
food security for 45 million more people,
resilience for 235 million more people,
global GDP increased by $1 trillion.
change is within reach.
Women need more access to and control over livestock, water, and seeds.
And the land, technology, and the finance needed to grow their livelihoods. Eliminating discrimination.
Brings tangible benefits.
Intervention is essential at every level of agri-food systems.
Engaging with men and boys makes change happen faster.
Changing national policies and social norms is vital.
Ensuring that women have a greater voice in policy and decision-making.
Collecting high-quality data,
Can measure progress towards equality.
working with groups and collective action,
Gives women greater access to technology.
and improves resilience for whole communities. It's time to make the change.
Good morning. I'm Caitlin Welsh, Director of the CSIS Global Food Security Program. Welcome to today's online armchair discussion on the status of women in agri-food systems with Dr. Lauren Phillips and Dr. Vanya Slavchavska from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Women are employed across agriculture and food systems worldwide. In many places, agri-food systems are the main employer for women. More than 10 years ago, the UN FAO released its most comprehensive report to date on this topic, called Women in Agriculture, Closing the Gender Gap for Development. The findings of that report were stark. According to the FAO, women in agriculture in rural areas had less access than men to productive resources and opportunities. But if women had the same access to productive resources as men, they could increase yields on their farms by 30%, raising total agricultural output in developing countries, which could reduce the number of hungry people in the world by up to 17%. These findings were impactful, but they were not enough to close these gaps. The FAO revisited this topic in the Status of Women in Agri-Food Systems report released earlier this month. This report found that women's access to land, input, services, finance, and digital technologies continues to lag behind men's. Discriminatory social norms affecting women and girls remain central to these inequalities. Shocks and crises have a greater negative impact on women's livelihoods in agriculture than on men's, and differences in coping mechanisms may worsen gender inequalities. All of these challenges to women's full and equal employment in agri-food systems hold back their productivity and sustain wage gaps. And the bottom line, according to the FAO, is that closing the gender gap in farm productivity and the wage gap in agri-food systems would increase global GDP by nearly $1 trillion, reducing the number of food insecure people by 45 million. These findings are stark, and the stakes are still high. This time around, will they spur enough action to finally achieve equality in agri-food systems? Here to unpack the report's findings and recommendations are none other than the report's main author, Dr. Lauren Phillips, Deputy Director of the Inclusive Rural Transformation and Gender Equality Division at the UN FAO, and Dr. Vanya Slavchavska, Social Policy Officer in the same office at the FAO. Dr. Phillips and Dr. Slavchavska are based in Rome, so it's really a pleasure to host you both at CSIS today. I look forward to speaking with each of you soon, after which I'll open the floor to questions from our audience. Whether you're joining us in person or online, we invite you to submit your questions at the Ask Questions Here button on the event page. But first, I'm very pleased to turn to Dr. Lauren Phillips for a brief presentation on the findings of the Status of Women in Agri-Food Systems report.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having us. I believe that you've already seen a little bit about the key messages of the report by watching the video that started this, but what I'd like to do is quickly present sort of 5 key messages from the report, talk a little bit about the policy recommendations from the report, and finish with the calls to action, which Caitlin has already started to highlight for us. So this report is a comprehensive look at the status of women in agri-food systems. That means beyond agriculture. So we stretch from the field production, primary agricultural production, through processing, packaging, transport, retail, and consumption of foods to try to take a comprehensive look at women's roles across all of this sector. We highlight how different segments of the agri-food system are impacted by structural and gender inequalities, which are linked to both gender and other types of intersectionalities. So for example, women's age, their ethnicity, or their disability status. And this reflects a transition from the first report that Caitlin was mentioning, which really looked at gaps, gender gaps, to an approach which is focused on gender transformative change, which means putting women's empowerment and gender equality as an objective in and of itself and as a means to transform agri-food systems. The first major finding of the report is that agri-food systems are a major employer of women in the world. More than a third, or 36% of women globally, are working in this sector, along with 38% of men. This represents a decline since 2005. That's what the graph there is showing you, because fewer women are working in the primary agricultural production than they were 10 or 15 years ago. So 10% less women are working in primary production, whereas the off-farm part of the agri-food system is growing. And these global numbers really hide a great deal of regional variation, because in many low and lower middle income countries, agri-food systems represent a much greater share of women's employment. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, 66% of working women are working in this field, and in Southern Asia, that rises to 71% compared to 47% for men. The second major finding of the report is, despite the importance for women's livelihoods, the conditions in which women are working in agri-food systems are not equal to those of men. In fact, women's roles are often marginalized, and their working conditions are worse than those of men. Their work is irregular or informal, part-time in many cases, despite their desire to work in full-time jobs. They tend to be segregated into low-value and low-skilled parts of the value chain where they have intensive work, and that means that overall their jobs are more vulnerable. I want to talk a little bit about that vulnerability on this slide by telling you that women are more likely to be in vulnerable employment in agri-food systems in both the on-farm and off-farm parts of the system. So in agriculture, women are much more likely, in fact half of women, 49%, are working as contributing family workers, which means that they're working on family farms compared to only 17% of men. That's a type of vulnerable employment. And additionally, in the off-farm segments of AFS, fewer women are working for wages or salaries. So we have 60% of women working for wages or salaries and 75% of men. That means that more women are in vulnerable positions in the off-farm part of the value chain as well. The report engages deeply with the types of gaps that we were mentioning from the previous report, including the gap between women and men's farm productivity and wages. So we find that on farms of the same size, there's a gap of 24% between female and male managed farms in terms of their productivity, and that women are only earning 82 cents on the dollar in wage work in agriculture. These sort of gaps are driven by a variety of factors: skills, education, the size of land plots, but it's also strongly driven by discrimination, which explains both why there's a wage gap and a productivity gap. The report also tries to engage with the way that inequalities in unpaid domestic and care work limit women's opportunities in the sector. And we find that on average, women spend 4.2 hours a day in unpaid or domestic care work, whereas men spend less than 2 hours. And this gap can widen to as much as 10 times in low and low middle income countries. The third major finding of the report is that women's access to assets and resources continue to lag behind men's. And in fact, we find it alarming how little the gap has closed over the past decade. There are some bright spots in finance and digital technologies, which I'll highlight, but I want to start by showing you the major gap that we find in land. Land is obviously a major input and necessary for agricultural production and very important for women's work in agri-food systems. And FAO is the custodian for 2 of the SDG 5 indicators on women's access to land, and we found that in 40 out of 46 countries, women have greater ownership of land than men. And you can see this in the graph by all of the small dots that are above that diagonal line. Those are all the countries where men have greater ownership of land than women. Additionally, the protections for women's land rights in the law are low or very low in half of countries, or 50% of countries. As I mentioned, there are some good news in the report. We see that there's a shrinking or narrowing gap in access to mobile internet, which narrowed from 25% to 16% over the past 5 or so years. And there's similar narrowing of the gap in finance. The 4th major finding of the report is that discriminatory social norms and rules, including policies, are at the heart of gender inequality, and they are very slow to change. We analyzed a number of norms which are related to agri-food systems, such as whether or not people believe that children suffer when women work outside the home. In fact, the majority of people believe that children do suffer when women work outside the home. Or the acceptance of gender-based violence. In many countries, wife beating remains acceptable. In fact, gender-based violence is one of the themes that we discuss throughout the report, because it's very important for the conditions under which women live and work in agri-food systems. The last point I wanted to make on this slide is that there's a little bit of better news in terms of the scope of change for policies in rural development and agriculture. 75% of policies in that field amongst 68 countries that we analyzed now recognize women's challenges, but less than 20% have specific policy goals which are trying to alleviate the challenges that women face or gender gaps. These findings are from Chapter 4 of the report, where we're also putting a very strong emphasis on the importance of women's empowerment, which we believe is essential for women's well-being. And despite the fact that we think that women's empowerment is an objective in and of itself, we also wanted to highlight the benefits that come with greater empowerment. So this table is showing you the degree of agreement and evidence about the impact of empowerment on a variety of goods, like agricultural production increases, increased food security, improved dietary diversity, and improved child nutrition. The 5th chapter of the report looks at the impact of gender on shocks and stressors, the ways that gender inequalities interact with shocks and stressors, and we look at 3 types of shocks: COVID-19, climate change, and conflict. And on this slide, I've highlighted a couple pieces of data, especially around COVID-19. So COVID-19 had a very dramatic impact on women's employment overall. Women were 4 times more likely to lose their jobs in agri-food systems than men. And in the off-farm part of the sector, what you can see in the bars there is that the peach is showing declines of women's work in the off-farm part of the sector, and the darker bar is men's. So globally, 22% of women lost their jobs in the off-farm part of the sector in the first year of the pandemic, compared to just 2% of men. And the food insecurity gap widened dramatically during COVID-19, from 1.7% to 4.3 percentage points between 2019 and 2021. That represents 126 million more women who are experiencing food insecurity. The last point here is that climate change also has uneven impacts on women and men's well-being. And so during times of heat stress, while both men and women have to work fewer hours in the field due to heat, women reduce their working hours less, which means they stay in the field longer, working in more difficult conditions. Some quick policy highlights, and then I'll try to wrap up, Caitlin. So in terms of the 5 policy highlights I wanted to highlight here, gender transformative approaches, or approaches which try to engage with social norms, are promising because they're both cost effective and can shift norms at the local level. So they're very important, and we'll talk more about that, I think, later. Closing gaps in land tenure is critical because it brings a variety of benefits, like increasing women's employment and their investment in their land, improves natural resource management, access to services, improves resilience, food security, and reduces gender-based violence, which is very important. Social policy, access to childcare, also has a very positive impact on women's employment and their returns in agri-food systems. Group-based approaches, which encourage women's collective action, are important for increasing empowerment and their resilience. It improves their uptake of technology, for example, to adapt to climate change. And social protection is a very important mechanism for increasing women's employment and for enhancing resilience, and that's all types of social protection, from job creation schemes to conditional cash transfers to non-conditional cash transfers. The calls to action of the report are three. The first is that this report was facilitated by an increase in sex disaggregated data over the past 10 years, but there's still many areas where we did not have high quality research and data available in order to say what works. And so we are encouraging better collection of data on age, on ethnicity, and the ways that these kinds of variables interact with gender, but also in particular areas, like in climate change, we found very little information that was sex disaggregated. The second call to action is the one that Caitlin was highlighting at the beginning, which is that if we're able to close some of the gaps that I mentioned in productivity and wages, we could have a dramatically positive impact on GDP growth, so by 1% or almost $1 trillion, and increase food security for 45 million people. And third, we believe that interventions have to be intentional and they have to focus on women's empowerment, because projects which focus and interventions which focus on women's empowerment have better outcomes in terms of incomes and resilience. So if we were able to reach half of small-scale farmers with these kinds of empowering approaches, we believe we could improve the incomes of an additional 58 million people and improve the resilience of an additional 235 million people. That's it for me. Thank you so much, Caitlin.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. We will draw on all of this information in the remainder of our conversation today. Two questions for you before I turn to Dr. Slivchowska. First question for you, Lauren, is about shocks and stressors, which you just told us about. The report addresses the disproportionate impact of shocks and stressors like COVID-19, climate change, and conflict on women. Why do these shocks and stressors often have a more negative impact on women than on men?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of the reason is because of the condition that women find themselves in before there's a shock or a stressor. So they may have lower degrees of savings, fewer assets, fewer human capital skills to draw on, and that means that they are likely to have different kinds of abilities to adapt and to overcome shocks, so their resilience capacity may be lower. And this is true for all of the shocks that we look at. So we find that during COVID-19, women were very likely to draw down their assets quickly. Their savings were less and they drew them down very fast. And of course, during climate change and during conflict, women may not have the same kind of access to supportive resources like social protection that men have. So building those kind of gender transformative or gender inclusive approaches from the beginning is really important.
Great, thank you. You also talked about the importance of scaling approaches, the scaling interventions, and about the importance of implementing, and this is a couple quotes from the report, gender transformative approaches at scale. And while localized interventions which address multiple inequalities have been proven to close gender gaps in empowerment in agriculture systems, agri-food systems, they should be carefully scaled up. There's a lot of buzzwords in there. How do we do this? How do we do this scaling?
So what we found is that a lot of the interventions that I mentioned have been very successful, but they haven't been deployed at large scale. So they're having a localized positive impact. So what we're interested in finding out is how we can first change policy frameworks to encourage the things that we know that work to be mainstreamed in national policies. But also I think being more cognizant of including positive approaches across all types of interventions in this sector. So we don't want only projects which are focused on benefiting and mainstreaming for women, or projects which say, okay, this is a project just for women's empowerment. We'd like to see all projects taking an empowering approach, because we believe that that could help to shift things at a greater scale.
Okay. Thank you. We will come back to a number of these themes in a little bit, but thank you again, and very happy right now to turn to Dr. Vanya Slivchowska, who's the Social Policy Officer, again, in the Inclusive Rural Transformation and Gender Equality Division at the FAO. Welcome to CSIS.
Thank you.
First question from you, Vanya, is about wage and productivity gaps. These are two of the most shocking findings, the most difficult findings. One is that the gender gap in land productivity between female and male managed farms of the same size is 24%, and that and on average, women earn 18.4% less than men in wage employment in agriculture. What is behind these differentials?
Thank you. This is a great question, Caitlin, and it's somewhat complex, but I'll try to be short. So we have identified three main set of factors that play a role particularly in the productivity gap. And the first one is scale. Like at what scale land size at which the gender gap in agricultural productivity is measured matters. And why it matters? It matters because the 24% is for farms of similar size. In reality, women tend to farm farms that are much smaller in size. And what the literature finds is that farmers, when they farm smaller farms, they achieve higher productivity, perhaps because they farm them more intensely, they put on extra effort. So this is very critical to understand, to be able to also communicate about gender gaps in agricultural productivity. Another set of factors is access to resources, and that counts for both agricultural productivity as well as gender gaps in wages. Women tend to have lower education, lower experiences, lower access to resources, and that contributes to expanding the gender gap in agricultural productivity as well as wages, which was also one of the findings that SOFA 2010-11 highlighted. But what is new in this report is the role of discrimination, and this is the third factor that we would like to emphasize. Because closing the gender gaps in access to resources would not be sufficient to close the gender gap. We need to also actively work and address discriminatory social norms and tackle discrimination at every scale.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. We'll come back to these themes, I'm sure. Next question for you, Vanya, is about data, and this is the first of the three calls to action that Lauren highlighted. This report, compared to the report that the FAO issued 12 years ago, benefited from increased amounts of data on women in agri-food systems, and yet the first of the three calls to action, one of the main findings of this report is for the collection and use of high-quality data disaggregated by sex, age, and other forms of social and economic differentiation.
So, so the report benefited tremendously from the increased amount of quality sex disaggregated data, and we wouldn't have been able to produce it were it not for that data. But along in the writing of the process, we identified also significant gaps that remain in the granularity, in the both at spatial as well as at time dimension, in the availability of data, quality data. And Lauren highlighted a few examples, such as the lack of data on intersectional inequalities, like at the intersection of age, indigenous identity, ethnicity, and so forth. There are plenty of other examples. For example, we still don't have harmonized national level measure of women's empowerment that can be employed in national survey data. And that really impedes our ability to measure, to monitor, to measure, and to advocate for accelerating progress in gender equality and women's empowerment in agri-food system. And finally, another example that I would like to highlight is the lack of cost-benefit data. So we often know what works. We have plenty of impact evaluation, but availability of whether how much they cost and how much the difference in cost between the status quo, doing business as usual, and employing some of these more gender transformative or gender responsive approaches is lacking.
Thank you, and we look forward, and soon we hope to be able to see the results of this qualitative and quantitative research. Thank you. Again, I'd like to invite our audience in person and online to submit questions using the Ask Questions Here button on the event page. We have one question in right now. This is, we can get questions from all over the world, but this question is from Northern Virginia, right outside DC. And it is about supporting women in government. Women's voices are necessary in government and leadership positions in order to inform the policies discussed in this report. What can we do to level the playing field in these positions, ultimately supporting women's empowerment in agri-food systems?
That's a great question. So I think that the report does highlight that having women's participation in policy processes is really critical. It talks particularly about the lack of women's participation in policy processes around climate policies, where there has been a lot of attention about getting increasing participation. And I think that there's two different levels in that question. So the first is having women participate actively in local governance and local institutions. One of the findings that I highlighted is that collective approaches work well, but collective approaches have to be inclusive of women. So they have to be participating in farmers' organizations and cooperatives, in credit and loan savings groups. And that sort of participation is still really lacking. There's some data in the report about women's participation in cooperatives, but also about their lack of participation in, say, water governance institutions. And so increasing their participation both through active policies and encouragement, but I think also by addressing the constraints that women face for participation, like their time burden, those are really important. And finally, I just wanted to say that having role models, so increasing women's participation in leadership positions in these kinds of institutions, encourages other women to follow and to take part.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I will turn right now back to Vanya with a question for you. This is actually about the private sector. The report outlines several ways to achieve equality in agri-food systems, but most of the recommendations and the elements of the calls to action were targeted toward policymakers. What's the role of the private sector in this regard?
Thank you, Kathleen. That's a great question. And a question that has come up several times throughout this. So the private sector has a huge role to play in opening opportunities for women, in leveling the field for women, both supporting women entrepreneurs, but also supporting a better working environment for women, for their workers. And as Lauren highlighted in the presentation, what we find is that women are segregated. Occupational segregation is hugely important in agri-food system. It contributes to women's lower earnings, but often even within the same activities, women tend to earn less than men. They are often working part-time, even when they're willing and available to work full-time, and they tend to be segregated in the lower skilled jobs. So closing these gaps is in the private sector can work actively to close that by, for example, facilitating pathways for women in leadership positions, not overlooking women for management positions in agri-food system businesses, building their capacities and nurturing their capacities. There is a role to actively tackle discrimination by ensuring that women are paid equally for doing the same work, and also work of similar value deserves equal pay. This is just like a couple of the examples. For example, in working with entrepreneurs, what we find is that in women entrepreneurs often don't have lack access to machinery, to irrigation technology, and so forth, because often these technologies are not developed with women in mind. And this is where both public and private intervention can do a lot to support women entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll turn back to you with some more questions soon. First, so I'd like to ask Lauren another question. Lauren, this is about social norms, and this is something that you highlighted as an element that works to achieve greater equality in agri-food systems, but I imagine that it's quite difficult to achieve. The report itself notes that addressing gender equality and women's empowerment means addressing constraining social norms and rigid gender roles affecting how women participate in agri-food systems. How do we address these? First question. Second question is, how do we involve men, boys, and community leaders in the process, which is something that was specifically recommended by the report?
Great question. So when we're trying to address social norms, it means deep engagement with communities and with people about their beliefs and the things that they think women should be doing or should not be doing. And therefore, as I acknowledged, they are slow to change, right? It's hard to have a change at scale sometimes. But some of the approaches that you mentioned, like not thinking that it's just women who have to change their behaviors, but working with members of the family who are men, or working with local community leaders to point out, for example, the benefits of having women have greater mobility so that they can leave the home, or of sharing the care burden between men and women and how that might improve the household's income or their resilience to shocks. So a lot of the approaches have to do with discursive methods, which include various members of the community, and others are aimed at helping women to articulate their own ambitions or their own constraints, and including others in the conversation about what would we need to do to get you from point A to point B. So there's a variety of different methodologies that seem to work, Many of them are deployed at local levels, and so I think that one of the important things to do is to acknowledge that discriminatory social norms are keeping us from achieving gender equality and women's empowerment, and trying to address them and tackle them head on.
Yeah. Well, I guess you brought us back to something we talked about a bit earlier, which is about interventions that work at the local level and the fact that they must be scaled. As part of your own research and your field work, either recent or several years ago, wondering if you can share examples of what some of these things might look like on the ground at the community level. Does anything come to mind for either of you?
Do you want to take a? I'll start with one while Vanya's thinking. So one finding that we highlight in the report is about the benefits of having childcare. So I think people are sometimes surprised by this finding because they tend to think of childcare as something that happens like, for professional women or a need for childcare. But actually, there's a study that we highlight in the report that was from the Congo, from Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they provided formal and structured childcare for women who were working in agriculture and primary production. And the findings were that because women didn't have to multitask between taking care of young children while they were working, their productivity increased, but also their sense of well-being increased because they really felt like they had a burden lifted from them. I think many of us who are parents can understand that. And they reported a stronger sense of sort of satisfaction with their work. So I think that both the tangible and personal and intangible benefits were really large from these kinds of approaches.
And I imagine that those go a long way in increasing productivity and wages as well.
Yeah.
Vanya, how about you?
So another, I think, example about scaling out interventions that comes to mind is really social protection. I think this is a great example. This is one of the findings that we found has significant benefits in improving women's employment and labor market outcomes generally, in building their resilience and even facilitating their access to resources, key resources necessary for work in agri-food systems and for their livelihoods. And we have examples of how governments have been successful in scaling out social protection. And so this is a good example of an intervention that probably often start as pilots, but then they scale up and have huge benefits, and they can reach a lot of farmers and women.
Any particular community come to mind, or any country, or?
So there is a wonderful example about the role of social protection in Latin America and how they have benefited women. Those similar social protections, such as the cash transfer programs, conditional cash transfer programs, have also been replicated in sub-Saharan Africa. And FAO was particularly interested in addition to looking at the role of social protection in improving child and some of these immediate benefits, also in the role of women's empowerment, but also building livelihoods in agriculture and agri-food system with a program that FAO supported.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question that we received online. And it's about something that that Lauren, you and I just talked about. It's about male allyship. What are some steps that men and boys can take to help shift harmful or restrictive gender norms? How can men and boys be allies in these efforts?
A lot of the examples that I was just thinking about from your previous question as well are about how men and boys can be included in training or in approaches from the beginning. So I'll give you two. So the first is on the childcare example again. When men are also offered the opportunity to have childcare facilities or be included in conversations about childcare, their well-being also increased. So making men active parents in situations where maybe no social norms previously dictated that it was women's work to take care of young children improved men's sense of well-being as well. So that's one example. And another example is on land titling. So a lot of the sort of experimental approaches that are being tried by colleagues, there's the Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank who has been looking at providing incentives for putting both men and women's names on land titles, joint titling from the outset, and they found a lot of ways to incentivize through training programs or through compensation to include women, and that has really improved the extent to which women have legal protections for their land.
Yeah.
So I think there's a variety of experimental approaches going on making sure that men and women are working together in extension, in land, in social policies, etc.
Okay, thank you. It helps to build some examples around that important recommendation from the report. One other question from the DC area is about country strategies from the UN Food Systems Summit. Since the FAO is leading the coordination of the UN Food Systems Summit follow-up, is there an opportunity to address some of the challenges raised in this report through the country strategies that are being developed as part of that?
Great question. So FAO is hosting the hub, which is coordinating the response to the Food Systems Summit, and there's an important stock-taking moment to see what progress has been made that's coming up in July. FAO is leading, along with a couple of partners, the Coalition on Making Food Systems Work for Women and Girls. And part of the initial analysis that that coalition had undertaken was to see to what extent the national pathways that the question is referring to had incorporated gender as an important way to transform agri-food systems. And we were positively impressed to find that a number of countries, and not maybe the obvious countries, had really put a strong focus on gender in their pathways. And so the coalition is now meeting for a dialogue and trying to encourage countries which put a lot of emphasis on gender to join the coalition so that we can provide technical knowledge and policy support to those countries. And that's in coordination with our partners, WFP, IFAD, SIWA, CARE, UN Women, and others.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I have a few questions for both of you as we round out our conversation. One is I guess I'll harken back to the first report that the UN FAO put out on this issue, which was published in 2011. This current report obviously builds on the findings of that report, and the current report is the result of a lot of effort on your part. So I don't mean to give any additional homework to you or to have you look at it. It definitely is time to rest on your laurels for a bit and celebrate this moment. If you were to look ahead to another report, if the FAO were to invest in another report on this, what would you hope to see in that report, both in types of information and also findings? But these reports are obviously incredibly useful for the policy community and others. What would you hope to see in a third iteration?
Do you want to answer?
I can go first.
Go ahead.
So there are several things that I would like to see in going forward. Of course, we want to see progress in closing some of these very sticky gaps in access to key resources, in women's wages and earnings, in child care distribution. So I would like to to see those, we also need to be able to collect better data. So I would really hope that we will have much better data from all regions around the world on this, so that we can describe with more nuance the status of women in agri-food systems, what gaps have been closed, and what has driven also some of the successful approaches in closing these gender gaps.
Okay.
I'll leave it to Lauren.
I think I am positively impressed by the shift that Vanya described between sort of just looking at gaps to thinking about empowerment and social norms and policies, which I think we found mixed evidence on. But I think having a way to think more comprehensively about all of the co-benefits that come with women's empowerment, so that this is not something, I mean, we're doing it because it's important in and of itself. It's important for women's well-being, for family and community well-being, but there's also so many reasons to work through this tool, right? Working with women, it has a benefit on child nutrition, it has a benefit on resilience, it has a benefit on productivity. So it really makes economic, social, and moral sense to continue to put the focus on empowerment as well as closing gaps.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously that's one of the most impressive things about these reports is that you talk about those benefits at the community and global level, reductions in poverty, increases in global GDP, et cetera. As I mentioned at the outset, just knowing about the extent of these gaps, knowing is not enough to spur action. And we knew these things very well when the first comprehensive report was published in 2011. We have more information now. The nature of gaps has changed. The extent of gaps has shifted as well. What do we need to transform knowledge into action? I'm sure that the last time around, I know that the last time around the report was very influential in US policy with regard to development and food security and agriculture in low and middle income countries. But that's, again, not enough to close these gaps. So what do we need? What do we need to do this time around?
I think on that, what we need to do is really dig deep into some of the more detailed descriptions of tools and methods that we are highlighting in the report, and encourage their uptake, use, and their spread, basically. So the report highlights some of these gender transformative approaches that I mentioned. I think that there's still a lot of debate in the literature about these and what they should be called and what they're actually doing. They're not trying to force norm change. I think what they're trying to do is to identify things that women themselves feel are constraints in their community and work through them. And I think that there isn't enough evidence, as Vanya was saying, about the cost and benefit of these kinds of approaches, but we were encouraged to see that they do work, and that we need to sort of increase the awareness around these kind of approaches so that people can mainstream them into their agriculture and agri-food systems investments and policies, basically.
Great, thank you. Vanya, what about you?
And just to add to building on what Lauren mentioned, I think what we did try in this report is to demystify a bit more what it means to tackle gender dynamics, to address gender gaps in agricultural productivity, and did that. And we tried really hard that in the last chapter, where we looked at what has worked, and we put a successful example so that we can better communicate about how to change, how to affect change in on gender equality and women's empowerment, how much it would cost, so that we try to convince policymakers and other stakeholders that these are approaches that have worked in certain contexts, that there is strong evidence that they work, that they don't necessarily cost a lot more than they are already investing in. And I think with that, we are trying to move more from building knowledge to really influencing implementation with pragmatic and practical recommendations.
Sure, they don't cost more and the benefits outweigh the costs in many
exactly.
cases. Last of this 3-question series, for Lauren first, is obviously a lot of the findings of this report are difficult, they're not inspiring, difficult to read. Sometimes they're surprising, sometimes they are not surprising. But still there are signs of hope, and I heard you mention a few in your presentation. Having authored this report, what gives you hope?
I think what gives me hope is that two things. First, I mean, we found a lot of things that are working, despite the gaps still being persistent. And when you're looking at new technologies, for example, and women's access to new technologies, these are gaps that are closing. They're gaps that allow people to sort of leapfrog. So the gap in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, in access to mobile money is really closing, and that's due to an effort to reach rural areas. So we're closing finance gaps through a digital tool. So I think that the combination of using new technologies, that makes me hopeful. But the other thing that makes me hopeful is that this report has so far garnered quite a lot of attention. So thank you for having us. But I think that that's also a sign that people are looking for ways to reduce hunger, to reduce poverty, to transform agri-food systems, and including women and having gender equality and women's empowerment is certainly a very good way to do that.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Vanya, how about you?
So I was thinking that it's been more than a decade when I actually started working on gender dynamics in agriculture, in development, in economics. And what gives me hope, and at the time when I started, it was a lot more difficult to talk about gender issues, to explain, to get people's attention, as Lauren mentioned. And even though we are not seeing a lot of gaps closing, and the progress that we have achieved in some dimensions, particularly in Agri-Food Systems, is slow or inadequate, I feel hopeful because now we no longer need to make the business case often about investing in women and closing gender gaps and empowering women. And it's just so much easier within our organization, in the international development community, to speak about that and to understand that addressing gender equality is good in and of itself, in addition to the co-benefits that it has.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks. So before we wrap up, just want to give you each an opportunity to make any final remarks, and maybe there was a question that you wanted me to ask and I didn't get to ask it, but anything that you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up.
No, I would just say that the report is available with an overview that sort of summarizes a lot of what we discussed today, and that's available in the 6 official languages of FAO. And we also, the full report contains a huge amount of detail about all of the issues we talked about, and so I would really encourage people to dip in on whatever the topic is that is of interest to them, if it's about land, or if it's about climate change, if it's about conflict, which we didn't have much occasion to talk about. I think that there's plenty of information in there to be utilized.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. Thanks for that reminder. Vanya.
So I don't have major closing remarks, but I was just thinking that one of the key takeaways, I think, of the report is that we all have a role, and it's like really reiterating the message from the film that you saw at the beginning, is that we all have a role to play in spurring change towards gender equality and women's empowerment. So I think that what I would like to see is more advocacy, more funding, and just to reiterate the calls for action from the report in investing in good and quality data and evidence on gender issues, in trying to close the gender gaps, being intentional and trying to tackle discrimination, and investing at scale, at all scales. As I said, we all have a role to play.
Good,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. Perfect place to conclude our discussion. With that, I want to thank you again, both Lauren Phillips and Vanya Slivchavska, for joining us today, based in Rome. So again, such a pleasure to have you here at CSIS. Thank you to our audience in person and online for joining us. Thank you to the UN Food and Agriculture, UN FAO North American Liaison Office for partnering with us in today's event, to the CSIS Global Food Security Program and External Relations teams, who I believe set the standard for event production. Again, to our audience, thank you for joining us. This concludes our event. Please follow us on Twitter at CSIS Food.